Hi, this is Kim Hammer, pastor of Saline Baptist Church, community of Tull, outside of Benton, with your devotion taken from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 1, beginning with verse 6. The one thing we need to be mindful of is that Moses in the book of Deuteronomy is giving an overview of all the events in the book of Numbers. And this is because the Lord, in a short period of time, is about to call Moses home to the eternal promised land, whereas the nation of Israel was about to inherit the promised land here on earth. And so Moses is giving his final charge to the nation of Israel. And as he does a look back over the events of the book of Numbers, which took 40 years to develop, he condenses it down in a very short period of time because he wants to give the nation of Israel a spiritual charge before he releases them to Joshua's leadership to go over into the nation of, over into the promised land. One thing that is also interesting, when Moses is giving the overview, he does not start in the land of Egypt, but instead he starts whenever it was that the nation of Israel had been delivered from Egypt and was beginning their journey on toward the promised land. Being mindful of the fact that from the place they crossed the Red Sea to the threshold of the promised land, Canaan, was actually only 11 days journey, but it took them 40 years to get there because of their sin. And Moses did not want the nation of Israel to go into the promised land with the burden of being burdened with the remembrance of the sins of the last 40 years that the elders had paid the price of. But Moses wanted them to have a fresh start and to remember the highlights of the things that had happened in the book of Numbers. When you pick up at verse 6, we find that the one thing Moses starts off by saying is the phrase, "the Lord our God." The phrase, "the Lord our God," is used over 300 times in the book of Deuteronomy. And so Moses is constantly reminding and indwelling in the mind of the Israelites that it was because of the Lord their God that they were about to experience what they were going to have in their journey into the promised land. He also said that you have stayed long enough at this mountain and that it was time to move on. The book of Ecclesiastes chapter 3 says that to everything there is a season, and it goes through a long list of comparisons or bookends, if you would, between things that we experience here in life. And the time had come for the season to end of the nation of Israel being in the wilderness for 40 years, and Moses is saying, you've stayed here long enough. You know, I don't think God expects us to dwell in our mistakes forever, that God wants to set us free, that we can move past the mistakes of our past in order to enjoy what he has waiting for us in the future. And Moses is saying, you've camped out here long enough. You've learned your lesson. It's time to take a fresh start and make a new journey into a bright future. We go on and we see that he says in verse 7 that they are to break camp and they're to advance. They're not to retreat back into their old ways, but they were to break camp in order to advance into the new opportunities that God had given them, that they should anxiously look forward to experiencing. When you look at verse 8, he said that God had given them the land, and the one thing that needs to be noted is that Moses is telling them, you're not going to inherit this land because of who you are. You're going to inherit the land because of who God is, and God is going to deliver on his promise that he said he would give you a land. And so he said God gave them the land, and he wanted them to know that it wasn't because of anything of their own that they were bringing to the table, but it was because God was delivering them to this opportunity. And in verses 9 through 10, it reminds us that the Lord fulfilled his promise to multiple generations, to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And this all goes back to the book of Genesis chapter 15 and verse 5, where God said he would make them as the sands of the sea, as the stars of the sky. And again, we find that in verses 9 through 10, that this is a reference that Moses is citing, how that God was going to promise to deliver them, and that he would multiply them to be as the stars of the sky. In fact, Moses goes on and he compounds that by saying he wanted God to bless them 1,000 times beyond what they had already been blessed. God had already fulfilled his promise, and now Moses was asking to increase that promise 1,000-fold, and God would do that. The one thing we need to understand, to remember, is that God blessed them as the stars of the sky, which means that they had to have a land mass sufficient enough to support them, and that's why God was going to give them such a big territory, because not only did God deliver on his promise that he would make them as the stars of the sky, but he also delivered on his promise that he would give them land sufficient enough that they could live in what's referred to as the promised land. He goes back and he also begins the journey regarding the law and the following of the law and the enforcement of the law by going back to a conversation that his father-in-law Jethro had in verses 9 and 10. And he said, "The needs of men are too great for me to bear." And by the time that Moses was approached by his father-in-law Jethro, it had already become a burden to him to have to sit and to judge the people, because they were standing from early morning until late night. And not only was it wearing down the people, but it was wearing down Moses. And so Moses reminded them of the legalistic system that was set in place in order for the people to have their disputes heard. And he breaks it down by hundreds and by thousands, by hundreds, by 50s, which is also aligned with the way in which the military was structured. And so the pattern was already there. And then it talks about the men that Moses called in order to be able to resolve the conflicts. He said regarding this, he said, "How can I bear your burdens? How can I bear your problems? And how can I settle your disputes when I'm only one man?" And because of the wisdom that God gave to Moses through his father-in-law Jethro, he recognized that he could not handle the problems, nor the burdens, nor settle all the disputes. You know, that's one of the problems with organizations or nations that grow. They might start off slow and they might start off small, but as they grow bigger and bigger, it multiplies the potential for conflicts. And there has to be a system in place whereby those conflicts can be resolved in a timely manner so that they don't turn into larger problems later. And that's what was happening in the nation of Israel. And God delivered unto Moses the systematic approach to dealing with this that is still applicable to our situation today as we see the structure we have here in this nation. Now, when it came to Moses picking out the individuals that were supposed to settle the disputes and the problems and also the burdens that the people had, he was looking for certain qualities. And Moses wanted to remind the nation of Israel that if they wanted to be successful moving forward, the judges that would be picked in order to settle the problems and the challenges and the disputes had to be people of character. And here were three things that were imposed as far as the standards. They had to be men of wisdom, they had to be men of understanding, and they had to be men that were respected. But also they had to know their limitations, because they were given confined numbers that they were settle disputes and problems and resolutions within that structure that Moses gave. But above all, we find that the qualities that they needed to possess were wisdom, understanding, and that they were respected among the people. And then he set them in positions of authority over the people. Without authority and without respect for authority, a nation cannot stand. And that's one of the challenges that we're confronted with today, is that there's a mob mentality, a thug mentality that wants to take law and order into their own hands. And one of the issues that we're facing as a nation today is that we have to have a value for the understanding that you have to respect authority and that you have to work within the confines of the system that's in place in order to keep law and order so that we can be a society and a nation that can stand. We find that the other qualities that Moses assigns to these individuals is that they have to be able to judge fairly, that they cannot show partiality, that they must hear all matters regarding whether it's from a small constituent or from a greater constituent. They all have to be treated on the same playing field. And then the other thing is that they can't be afraid of anything that may come along, that they may have to make matters of judgment, knowing that God is the ultimate judge. God is the ultimate judge. So the qualities that were placed upon these individuals to judge matters that were burdens, problems, and disputes was that they had to be wise, they had to be understanding, they had to be trusted with a reputable reputation, they had to be able to judge fairly, they could not show partiality, they had to hear all matters, whether small or great, with the same set of standards and the same level of importance and respect, and they could not be afraid of any judgment that they may have to render, knowing that ultimately God has the final judgment. When these things are in place, you have a society and a nation that can move forward. And I think that Moses intentionally was reminding the nation of Israel that as you go forward into this new opportunity, as you conquer the inhabitants of the land and you take possession of the land, What you need to remember is that if you don't have this structure in place to move forward with you, it's only a question of time before you destroy yourself from the inside out. And that would be a good lesson for us to remember in America today. Hope you have a great day.